Maya's research focuses on unraveling the complexity of the world's nitrogen challenges. Maya is currently a program manager for the Working Lands Innovation Center at UC Davis, where she is looking to scale carbon capture and negative emission technologies in agriculture. Please join me in welcoming Maya. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm really excited. I used to live in the Hudson Valley and I'm happy to speak to a familiar community. Yeah, so I was gonna sort of give a follow-up to that video, which was amazing to make. Vox does a great job with sort of really robustly checking the science behind the videos that they're making and doing just tremendous visualization efforts. So we're happy to get that out and have it more widely viewed, but there's a lot of details we didn't get to talk about. So today I'm going to talk about how food systems have contributed to climate change historically and opportunities that exist that could turn food systems into an important tool for combating climate change in the future. I'm the manager of the Working Lands Innovation Center, where we are trying to test soil amendment technologies in agricultural contexts in order to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So my personal research, I'm trained as a biogeochemist, which means we look at how chemicals cycle through the environment, through plant, soil, and the atmosphere. So my research really sits at the nexus between topics in ecology and biogeochemistry, food and agriculture, and how those topics interact with climate and global change. Today, I'm going to talk about the impact our food system can have on the environment with a focus on climate change. So we'll begin with a brief overview of climate change and how emissions are generated from our food system. Then I'll spend the bulk of the time talking about several projects I've worked on, looking at various climate smart strategies that include dietary change to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, soil amendments to capture carbon from the atmosphere, and then finally looking at how we can combine these different sorts of strategies in order to optimize our climate change solutions. So I'll begin by talking about climate change. This is an image from last year. So as we can see in this photo, climate change is here. It's a part of our daily lives for many of us. This shows much of California being on fire. I live in California normally. This is a privilege to be in Hawaii right now. And I was here for this, right? We couldn't leave our houses. It was pretty intense. And at the same time, you see blizzards happening sort of towards the end of summer in the mid-West US. So it's something that is affecting us every day. It's leading to more intense and frequent climatic events like blizzards, droughts, floods, wildfires, and it's also leading to more subtle changes like changes in precipitation and snowpack, as well as drought. So working in California has been really great because we're at the forefront of developing solutions and policy to combat climate change. So what's causing climate change? The answer is an increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions, the most prevalent of which is carbon dioxide. And this graph is showing carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And what we see is that there's natural oscillations in carbon dioxide concentrations that have occurred, but more recently, we are seeing this unprecedented increase in concentration at a rate that we've never seen before. And this is true not only for carbon dioxide, but also for greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide. So what happened around the time that greenhouse gas emissions started increasing? Well, we happened, right? And as we sort of evolved and became more sophisticated in our inventions, we invented electricity and cars and synthetic fertilizer production. And these are these amazing aspects of our society now that have really improved the quality of life. But they also produce greenhouse gas emissions at pretty large scales. When greenhouse gases are produced in the atmosphere, they sort of create this blanket around the Earth that traps in heat. So an increase in greenhouse gas emissions means that less heat escapes the atmosphere. As a result, we're experiencing an Earth that is warming quickly. This warming is causing changes to the intensity and frequency of floods, droughts, wildfire, and snowstorms. And also, like I mentioned, to sort of the ranges in which precipitation happens, the seasonality of precipitation, same with temperature. We're seeing these range shifts throughout our oceans and terrestrial ecosystems. So even though the world's warming, we have options in where we go from here. So this graph is showing global greenhouse gas emissions projected for the next century, where each color represents a different emissions trajectory depending on our actions. So in the worst case scenario, which is shown here in red, we do nothing and we see temperature increase dramatically. But in the best case scenario, which is shown in green down at the bottom, we not only reduce or offset all of our current emissions, but we also find ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in the biosphere, creating negative emissions overall. So if this is where we want to go, how do we get there? Well, luckily, food systems are a big part of the solution. So food systems have historically been a large source of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, as they talked about in that video. But they also have this really high potential for becoming carbon neutral and even removing carbon from the atmosphere, turning the food system from a carbon source to a carbon sink and helping us combat climate change. So before we talk about solutions, let's first explore where food system emissions come from. So when we think about food, more often than not, we think, I'm hungry, which is pretty common, especially spending all day at home. So you go, oh, yum, an apple. That sounds awesome. I'll eat that. I'll feel better. But what we rarely think about is what it took to get that apple to our kitchen and what's going to happen to that apple after we're done with it. But that apple is part of an elaborate system that includes the land, soil, and water that it took to produce that apple, the equipment, energy, and labor, the people who are picking that apple and putting it on a truck. That apple will often go to a processing plant where it's either bagged or boxed or packaged in some way so that it can be distributed via supermarkets and other distribution areas so that someone like you and me can go purchase that apple. After we finish it, right, we still have an apple core. So what do we do with that core? It either goes to a landfill or maybe you are composting that apple, which is great because then it can be applied back onto the land and used to produce more apples. So the apple and you, the person who's consuming it, along with all these other processes, make up our food system. And each of these processes produces greenhouse gas emissions. So we get a lot of nitrous oxide coming from the fertilizer we use to grow crops, or methane emissions might come from landfills. And so these are all sources of atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. So all the various aspects of our food system equate to agriculture being responsible for about 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions globally, which is similar to electricity. Electricity is 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's even more than transportation, which is 14% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. A lot of these emissions are coming from fertilizers applied to crops, enteric fermentation from ruminant animals. They have these stomachs that produce methane, and manure production and management. Most agricultural emissions occur as nitrous oxide or methane, which have way more warming power than CO2 because they're longer lived in the atmosphere, so they have more time to warm our planet. This is a map showing the livestock distributions worldwide. So livestock contributes about 14% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And this is because livestock and livestock feed are take up a considerable amount of land, much of which has to be converted from forests. And this is especially true in Brazil, where we are using a lot of land to produce soy-based feeds for cattle that were otherwise forest. And so when we cut down those forests, there's a large loss of carbon to the atmosphere. This is also because livestock produce methane from their ruminant guts, and because the manure that livestock produce is a big source of nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. So livestock play an important role in the future of climate change because they produce a lot of greenhouse gases, and this is especially true if we think about sort of the global trends in meat consumption, right? Human population is increasing, and the amount of meat that we are consuming is also increasing. So in the corner here, the smaller graph is showing the trend of meat consumption for the entire world. And then the larger graph is showing that broken down by countries. So there's certain countries where our meat consumption is sort of leveling off or even decreasing. And that's areas like Europe and the United States that are already really developed. And we are sort of learning from our doctors and from movements of vegetarianism that maybe the amount of meat we're eating should be curbed somewhat. Whereas areas that are still developing, as countries tend to improve their economics, they have a tendency to consume more meat, which is more of a luxury item. So because meat consumption is increasing, we're likely to see even more increases in food-related greenhouse gas emissions in the future. This graph is showing food-related greenhouse gas emissions in 2005 and those projected for 2050. So increases in meat consumption combined with population growth mean that food system emissions are expected to increase about 30% in the next 30 years. Now, this doesn't have to be the case if we implement climate smart practices that can reduce emissions and even remove carbon from the atmosphere. So next, I'm going to talk about some of those strategies for creating sustainable food systems. The food system currently emits about 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And this carbon dioxide equivalent, that just means that it encompasses the other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and methane all into one value for easy comparison. So one climate smart strategy is to just reduce emissions. So maybe you do that by turning your farming equipment into electric vehicles, or by reducing the amount of tillage you do on your soils at a local level. Another strategy is to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it into soil or soil plants, or actually geologic materials also. So this strategy might be called carbon capture, carbon removal, or carbon sequestration. An example of this would be agroforestry. You plant trees on your farm, and that way you're able to increase the amount of carbon stored in those trees on your land. Carbon offsets are a strategy that aim for carbon neutrality. So in this case, a company may continue emitting, but pay someone else to capture an equivalent amount of carbon in order to offset their emissions. And the last strategy combines emission reductions with carbon capture. So by having carbon capture exceed emissions, you can actually generate negative emissions in the food system that can then offset emissions from other sectors. So this last strategy is the ideal situation. And it's one that's really necessary if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So I'm going to talk about projects that represent these three different climate mitigation strategies. I'll start by talking about dietary change as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Then I'll talk about soil amendment practices on farms as a way to capture carbon from the atmosphere. And I'll finish by talking about how you can combine these strategies to sort of optimize the amount of carbon removal that you can get from food systems. Okay, so I'll start by talking about the topic we covered in the Vox video, which is reductions in emissions. So dietary change is an emission reduction strategy based on the fact that different foods have different carbon footprints. So if people change their diets, they can also change their carbon footprint. This graph is showing the carbon footprint of different foods and the breakdown of where those emissions come from. So it's a little small, and I apologize if it's difficult to see. The take home here is sort of that at the high end, the largest emissions are coming from ruminant animals like beef and lamb. And as you can see, a lot of that is on farm. This brown color represents farm emissions, which in the case of these ruminant animals is often methane from their guts. Beef also have this land conversion part of their footprint because they require a lot of grazing land that's often converted from forest. At the low end, you see a lot of plant-based foods, right? These are really low values. In the case of nuts, you can even get, afforestation that can remove carbon from the atmosphere. And then in between, sort of in the middle ground, are things like poultry and fish and other sort of animal-based protein sources. So in our Vox video, we performed a modeling study where we compared the global adoption of the American diet, a doctor-recommended diet, which had less meat consumption, the Mediterranean diet, which is sort of a flexitarian take on a diet where you have a little bit of meat, but it's much more rare than a normal diet, and then these vegetarian and vegan options. We showed pretty much what dozens of other studies have also shown, and that's that dietary choice can have a really big impact on greenhouse gas emissions in the future when they're applied at large scales. So while one person doing this might not have a huge impact on global climate change, this trend of large sectors of people eating a certain way can have a huge impact. So this is showing how your choices can reduce your personal contribution to climate change. And this is a really cool graph. It sort of shows how if you recycle or if you wash your clothes in cold water, sort of what the impact you as an individual can have on climate change. And one thing that's interesting here is that when it comes to your personal contribution, the impact of eating a plant-based diet is pretty powerful, right? It's right up there with using no car at all or switching your house to solar power. And it's also a way cheaper way to have a big impact, right? Solar panels are expensive and not all states have these sort of subsidies to help afford them. And this sort of personal choice can actually help you in the long run. So studies have found that people who incorporated some degree of vegetarian into their diet, whether that's sort of this flexitarian diet, pescatarian, or if you go all the way vegan, that this can lead to longer lived lives. Sorry, you can live longer, as much from 8 to 19% longer than those who don't incorporate any form of vegetarian into their diet. There's also a lot of other health impacts that can happen from this. So they've seen improvements in mental health, cardiovascular health, sort of decreases in stroke and heart disease. So there's a lot of benefits that can happen to you personally by making these choices and incorporating them into your diet. So personal choice is this great idea, right? This grassroots way of sort of changing our climate. And we definitely think that your individual choices can make a huge difference. And especially, I feel like the culture that you produce by those individual choices can also help. But it's also not quite as easy as it seems all the time, right? We've all tried to eat healthier and you sort of give it a try and maybe it doesn't stick as long as you'd like it to. So our diets do change all the time, but it's a little bit of a mystery how exactly those changes happen. And so if you think, for instance, of McDonald's or Coca-Cola, right? It's no accident that these products have become really popular in modern society. These companies spend a lot of money developing strategies that would increase consumption of their products. So the question we have now is how can we sort of understand these strategies and use them to create healthy diets that promote sustainability? And no one had really delved into this in the scientific literature related to diet and climate change. So me and some colleagues decided to look at 3 commodities for which consumption had increased dramatically in a short time period, and to see what the drivers of those changes might have been. So we looked at chicken, tilapia, and milk. And this is a graph of milk increases in China. So this is just one example. For each of the case studies we looked at, so those different commodities, we looked at their uprise in 3 different countries. And through doing this, we were able to find some trends. So we found that there were multiple drivers that worked together to promote the consumption of these products. In most cases, technology was a catalyzing force behind increased consumption of a product. So that technology might be improvements in animal husbandry or pasteurization of milk. These sorts of technologies can increase the supply of those products in a market. Once the supply of a product increased, the cost of that product fell, making it more affordable and accessible to way more people. The next step was sort of advocating for this product, marketing this product. And we found that public-private partnerships often played a big role in endorsing a product as something that was healthy or trustworthy for the public. So in the case of milk in many countries, for instance, milk became a part of the school lunch program. So it sort of became ingratiated into people's lives, or it became part of national health guidelines in some countries. So it was sort of endorsed as a healthy product by the government. And often the biggest hurdle can be cultural acceptance of the commodity. So in the US, there's been a bunch of marketing campaigns that have successfully turned milk and chicken into these products we associate with good health. And then if you look at the other end of the spectrum, places like India, where they have these deep-rooted religious traditions, they've managed to maintain sort of an aversion to beef, even while beef consumption has increased in a lot of the rest of the world. So culture can really make or break the acceptance of a product or a commodity into a society. So we know that diets can be changed and that dietary change can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the hope is that through identifying strategies that have been used in the past to change diets, we can change diets to be more sustainable in the future. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon farming, which is a strategy that's done less so at the personal level, but more so at the farm scale. So if any of the audience is involved in farming, this is one way that you can really think about how climate change, and even small scale farming, right? So there's people who are working right now to distribute soil amendments to local, backyard farms. It's all about scaling. So the more we can get these sort of technologies out there, the bigger impact they can have. So let's talk a little bit about carbon farming right now, which is a carbon capture or carbon sequestration practice. So carbon can exist in the environment in many different forms, right? It's part of plants, animals, soil, and the atmosphere. And what carbon farming aims to do is to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere and store it in either plants or soils, typically on farms. So one way to do this is through the application of soil amendments. And I'm showing a video here of us applying rock soil amendments to a farm in California. So most of our agricultural practices use the spreading of fertilizer or other inputs on their farms already. So soil amendments are sort of a practice it's relatively easy to implement with existing equipment and knowledge. In addition to carbon benefits, soil amendments have been found to have numerous benefits for degraded agricultural lands that include increases in plant and root biomass, decreases in greenhouse gases, increases in plant and soil nutrients, improved water holding capacity of the soil, as well as carbon benefits, increased carbon capacity in the soil. Some of the most common soil amendments that we see is that of compost, rock, and biochar. So these are 3 soil amendments that sort of take organic matter, except in the case of rock where we're taking inorganic matter, apply it to farms, and we're able to sequester carbon in those soils as a result. So I currently manage the Working Lands Innovation Center, where we're testing the carbon sequestration potential of compost, biochar, and rock in crop and rangelands throughout California. And this map is showing where our sites currently are. We're trying to test them across a broad range of soil types, climate types, and crop types so that we can better understand the carbon sequestration of these soil amendments. So we applied soil amendments at multi-acre scales and measured the response of crops, soils, and greenhouse gases. Our rock amendment has been especially impressive. Preliminary data have found that rock amendments like basalt and wollastonite significantly increase soil inorganic carbon, which is this bicarbonate on the right, and also increase yield. Here we're showing grain yield on the left. So those are not only carbon benefits, but also benefits to farmers in the form of increased crop production. We also saw decreases in nitrous oxide in response to ground rock amendments and increases in methane consumption, so the amount of methane that's being pulled out of the atmosphere. And at the Working Lands Innovation Center, so we're not just focused on soil measurements. It's a part of what we do, but our ultimate goal is to use mathematical models, outreach, and commercialization efforts to translate the science we conduct into real-world applications. So we work with government agencies. We're funded by a government agency using our carbon offset program money. We then take those funds and we work with suppliers, a number of stakeholders, people who supply soil amendments. We work with them to get the distribution networks going to get those soil amendments to our farms and onto farm fields. The farmers we work with are able to learn the skills that it takes to implement these practices and assist us with all the sort of upkeep of running a farm, because they're already doing this and they know everything. And we know very little as scientists, but we're able to make all the measurements on those farms, right? We can measure soil carbon, we can measure yield, and do all these in the scientifically robust way. And then part of our job is to then take the information we've learned and get that out to the public, and also try to get that back into on the desks of policymakers so that they can possibly incorporate some of these soil amendment technologies into their policies. So the last project I'm going to talk about is sort of thinking about how we can combine these strategies. So looking at both emission reductions through changes in diet, but also through carbon capture using different agricultural technologies. So in this study, this was a modeling study where we combined strategies of dietary change and agricultural technologies to see if we could achieve negative emissions for the food sector. And so we assume that half of the world adopts the Mediterranean diet, like in the Vox video, and then assume that the other half adopts the suite of climate change, climate smart agricultural technologies. And I'll share with you what those are. So the agricultural technologies we were looking at were both emission reduction technologies in black and then carbon capture technologies in yellow. And those included using hydrogen power to produce fertilizer instead of fossil fuels. We looked at manure digestion, so that's taking the manure from on farms and putting it through a digester that can produce biogas or can produce fertilizer that can then be used. That sort of eliminates that issue of manure sitting around and producing greenhouse gas emissions. We looked at different types of livestock feeds, so either different types of forage that can reduce methane emissions from livestock, or different types of feed supplements that we can give to grain-fed livestock. Agroforestry, where we incorporate trees onto farms. And then the three soil amendments I mentioned below, biochar, rock dust, and compost, which can all sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And then we looked at two marine strategies. So one is reduced trawling, because trawling, it creates a lot of drag and leads to a lot of CO2 emissions. And the second is a sort of new idea of seaweed farming, where you plant seaweed and then you bury that seaweed deep in the ocean where it becomes a long-term sink for carbon. So this graph is showing, well, we first wanted to look at the world without any dietary change. So this graph is showing greenhouse gas emissions, and anything below that black line means negative emissions. And then on the bottom axis, we're seeing the percent of adoption of agricultural technologies. So what this is showing is that we can achieve negative emissions for the food sector if 75% of the world adopted agricultural technologies. And that's without anybody having to change their diet at all. So these data show that agricultural technologies can achieve negative emissions on their own, but still considering the health and environmental benefits of dietary change, we wanted to incorporate this strategy into our analysis. In this graph, it's the same as the last graph, but in this scenario, we said half the world is going to adopt a Mediterranean diet. So in this case, right, we're sort of seeing an improvement in equity of food too in this scenario, because we're assuming people who are undernourished are getting more meat in their diet, people who are overnourished are getting less meat in their diet. So here we found that when half the world changes their diets, we could achieve negative emissions if just half the world adopted these climate smart practices. So this suggests that dietary change can be an important tool in helping us reach our emission goals. And one really cool thing is that we just looked at about a dozen agricultural technologies, but this is a really long list of a lot of agricultural technologies that are in the works. And these range from everything from improved feed for livestock, from genetically modified crops to improve nutrient efficiency, lab-grown food. Just there's a ton of things that are coming down the pipeline. At the bottom here, it's sort of showing how far along they are in development. So some of the research is just getting started. For others, they're already being implemented in practice. So these technologies have the potential to transform our food system, and it holds this great deal of promise for mitigating climate change through food systems in the future. One major barrier that still exists is mainly related to cost. So this graph is showing the carbon potential, carbon sequestration potential on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, the cost. So a lot of these, well, afforestry is relatively cheap. A lot of these other technologies are more expensive than is really attainable right now. So what we need to scale these technologies is to make them more affordable. And that can partially be done by developing carbon offset programs that'll pay farmers to use these techniques. The other thing we can do is to sort of research the co-benefits of these sorts of strategies. So for instance, rock amendments can increase yield and improve soil structure, and sort of providing these other reasons that might be attractive to farmers can help aid in the widespread adoption of climate-friendly practices. So what I sort of take away from the work that I do in food systems is that the system we have is sort of broken, right? Right now it leads to a lot of obesity in parts of the world, hunger in other parts, biodiversity loss, nutrient pollution, water resource use, and a lot of waste. But I also feel like there's little tweaks we can make in our food system that have the potential to bring about these amazing beneficial outcomes for food production, human health, and the environment. And by creating these science-based scalable models for climate mitigation, we can generate future food systems that are environmentally sustainable and promote human well-being. And that means not just, being insular in our scientific communities, but engaging audiences like you who come to these talks and can learn about different, practices you can do on your farms or ways that you can eat that can be environmentally sustainable. So it's really about not only getting the strong science, but also getting that science out into the hands of people who can then implement it. And by showing up here today, you guys are some of those people. So thank you so much for coming. And yeah, I'll take any questions.